You cried during a movie. I know it sounds weird, but just go there with me. Now, I'm not talking about getting a little bit worked up or shedding a couple tears. I'm talking about really getting involved in the story, embarrassingly so. You know those times when you're in the movie theater and you're with your friends and it's really not that sad, but it just comes over you and all of a sudden you're crying, and I'm talking about that kind of movement. I wonder what could be so strong to get us to that point. I have a few possibilities. Maybe it's Brad Pitt's facial expression. I mean, let's be honest, it's really convincing. It could be like the way the scene is filmed, the camera work. Maybe that music, that dramatic music that builds up that you don't even realize is happening, but it gets you to that point. I think all of these things could have a role in it, but the main thing that I think gets us from just watching the movie to watching the movie is one thing, and it's conflict. That's right. I want you to imagine that movie that you just thought about. It probably had some exciting element of conflict, something that got you stirring. Things weren't easy for the character in the story, right? There was something hard about it. There was something that character had to go through, to work through, to get to the happily ever after. Let's think about it. Do you think that Titanic, for example, would be one of the most popular movies in the world without the tragic iceberg? Not really. Or what about Cinderella, right? Let's say she didn't have a curfew. Do you think that as little girls we would have watched that movie over and over again if things were just perfect? I don't think so. We all become so involved in stories, in books, in musicals, in movies, because we can relate to that conflict. As humans, we're able to relate because conflict is one of the most basic parts of who we are. It's how we interact with others. It's just an essential part of how we're made. Donald Miller, who is one of my favorite Christian authors, has really explored this idea of conflict being necessary in a story, especially our story. He says that a character in a story is someone who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. He says that characters have to face their greatest fears with courage. That's what makes the story good. Well, the character in our story today is no stranger to conflict. Jacob was the son of Isaac and Rebekah. And as most of you probably know, he was the younger twin brother of Esau. Let me remind you of the family dynamics that Jacob dealt with for most of his life. It was custom at that time for the eldest son to receive the father's blessing. This meant that Esau, even though he was probably only a couple minutes older than Jacob, had the right to that sacred moment with his father. Well, Jacob wasn't too satisfied with that custom, as you can imagine, and neither was his mom. You probably remember that Jacob and his mother Rebekah plotted to deceive Isaac, who was growing old and had become blind. Isaac had asked Esau to go and hunt for some wild game and prepare him this tasty meal. After that, Isaac planned to bless Esau. Rebekah overheard this and became worried because she wanted Jacob to have the blessing. So Jacob dresses as Esau, the whole 9 yards, has his clothes on. He even puts the spur on his arms, which I think is kind of weird, but like to replicate Esau's hairy arms. The whole 9 yards. And Isaac buys it. He questions Jacob a little bit. He's a little confused as to why his voice sounds different than Esau's. But all in all, he buys the story and blesses Jacob. Obviously, Esau was furious when he realized Jacob had tricked him and stolen his father's blessing. He was determined to kill Jacob. But to protect Jacob, Rebekah and Isaac sent him to live with Rebekah's brother, Laban. Jacob continued to face struggle there. He worked diligently for years in pursuit of Laban's 2 daughters. But after a few years, Laban and his sons became resentful of how wealthy Jacob was becoming. Once again, Jacob was the target of hatred and frustration, so he decides to flee from Laban. He takes his wives and cattle with him, and he starts his journey towards Esau's house, going back to his home. So as you can see so far, Jacob's life is not one of rainbows and happy moments. It's constantly struggling to figure things out, fighting to be the man he wanted to be. On his journey towards Esau's house, he sent the messengers before him to test the waters, knowing that Esau had probably not forgotten their history as brothers. Jacob was so distressed that he desperately called upon God to save him from the hand of his brother. In his prayer, Jacob reminded God of his promise to make Jacob prosperous. He even gave his messengers these complicated instructions on exactly what to say to Esau. And you know how when we're the most nervous, that's when we're the most nitpicky about the little things. We make sure that everything is in place. And I can just see Jacob laying out all these instructions for his messengers to test the waters with Esau. Jacob intended to pacify Esau with gifts so that he might receive him. Well, this brings us to today's passage. That night, Jacob sent his wives, servants, and possessions across the Jabbok River, leaving him alone at the riverside. This is where things get kind of weird. A man comes and wrestles with him all night. Later on that night, Jacob realizes that this is not just some man with freaky hip magic tricks, but he is an angel, God in human form. They continue to wrestle throughout the night. Now, I know what you're thinking. What in the world? Why would God randomly show up as a man to wrestle with Jacob in the dark all night? It sounds weird. And on the surface, this passage does seem to be quite vague and strange. But we do know that it is no coincidence that God came to Jacob in the very midst of his distress when he was alone. He had to be separated from others to interact with God on this personal level. Oftentimes, as people who feel better in numbers, I think that we sort of fear this Jacob kind of isolation. We like to talk about community and building each other up together, and while those are wonderful things, and I love those things, this is not a moment of community. This is a moment of personal interaction between God and Jacob. Think about it. It would have been a little strange if one of his servants had been kind of watching the whole scene, or maybe one of his wives was watching there too. It had to be just God and Jacob. Only once Jacob is alone does God come to him and invite him to this night of wrestling. Now, I don't really consider myself to be a very violent person. And in fact, it's a little bit funny to picture me with like this tough face, like, bring it on God, like being tough with God. So you might think that I just want to have this quiet chat with the Father, right? That I just want to sit down and cozy up to him and just talk about life. But in actuality, I'm really envious of Jacob. And let me tell you why. I'm jealous of Jacob because he is given the chance to get up close and personal with the God I love. I don't know about you, but sometimes I have a hard time with the whole believing without seeing thing. In every other relationship in my life, I'm able to see the people around me. I can feel their presence beside me. I know exactly when they're upset or angry or frustrated or happy or pleased with me. I can feel that. And with God, I get frustrated because he sometimes is so, he's just this idea to me sometimes, and I can't exactly feel how he feels with me. But Jacob is right there. And so that's why I'm jealous, is because Jacob is given the chance to be so close to a God that is so big. The very idea that God would take on flesh to be with Jacob in his struggle is the kind of deeply personal interaction we all crave. And it took a healthy dose of solitude for Jacob to get there. Okay, in order for us to really understand this night of wrestling, we have to be open to a new kind of angel. We all have preconceptions of angels. I think we have an image of a Precious Moments angel. Okay, let's look at this little guy. Look how sweet he looks. I really just don't think that he's going to be like asking us to step outside and handle some spiritual business, right? Like, he's sweet and cute and neat. And this is how we envision angels. We see them as these gentle, helping, sweet little helpers. But sometimes these images of angels can reflect our ideas of God. Oftentimes we see God as this distant entity, far away from our real struggles of pain.